Most people have heard the term RAM, but not everybody knows it stands for random access memory. They don't really know what that means, and I'm going to kind of talk about that today. I'm also going to go into the origins and the history of RAM, and I'm also going to talk about how much RAM you may need for your computer. So most RAM you're going to see is going to be a small rectangular chip that you would insert into the motherboard. Now I'm going to kind of go into what RAM is on an abstracted level. So basically what I mean is, I'm not going to go into extreme detail in this video about what RAM is, but I'm going to kind of explain it to more of a broad audience. So what problem does RAM solve? Well, let's just say you want to run Windows operating system. If you were to run the Windows operating system directly from the hard drive, so if every time you need to do something it went to the hard drive to access that information, it would run incredibly slow. So RAM solves that. Now, to kind of talk about what random access memory means, I'm going to start with sequential access memory, or SAM. So sequential access memory is sort of like RAM, but it's a stick of memory, but in order to access the information that you want to access, it goes through all of the bits sequentially until it gets to the area that it's looking for. That's not exactly efficient, so if you're running tons of tasks at once, it would have to constantly go through the entire RAM stick from the beginning until it reaches the point that it's looking for over and over again. That's not very efficient. So what RAM does is it introduces random access. So it uses the concept of an address. And so the CPU figures out what address the bits lie that it's looking for, and it just goes directly to that. And that's why they call it random access. So there are many different forms of RAM before the RAM that we know today. The first was actually an electrically charged tube, or CRT, which stands for cathode ray tube. I said that right. It was invented in 1947 by Freddie Williams and Tom Kilburn. This device was referred to as the Williams-Kilburn tube. I know that's original. The tube was eventually able to hold 256 bytes of data for a period of a few hours. So that's actually a really small amount of data, guys. So I put this in here to kind of put it into perspective. That is a little more than enough to store the following quote from Steve Jobs in UTF-8 encoded text. "Technology is nothing. What's important is that you have faith in people, that they're basically good and smart, and if you give them tools, they'll do wonderful things with them." So it would be able to store that for a couple of hours before it was just gone. The second version of RAM was called the magnetic core memory, and it was released in 1947, but it wasn't until 1968 that the RAM that we know of today was invented by Robert Dennard, giving us dynamic random access to our memory. So that's kind of what I was talking about. Before that, it was very sequential. So in 1947, we can thank Robert Dennard for giving us basically the ability to have access to memory at a rate that is acceptable. So nowadays, there are many different forms of RAM. And it can be extremely intimidating, because if you were to go buy your own RAM and if you're new to this and you have no idea what you're doing, it can be extremely intimidating to choose the correct RAM. So I'm going to kind of go over some of the basic concepts here. So the current standard is still DDR3. Now a lot of computers nowadays are using DDR4, but still the most common is DDR3. So I would say, this is just a complete guess, maybe 70% of computers nowadays are probably using DDR3. And it's also the fact that the price of DDR4 is still a lot higher than DDR3 due to the cost of manufacturing. But a modern RAM stick is what is known as DIMM, which stands for Dual Inline Memory Module. This is the successor to its predecessor, SIMM, which stands for Single Inline Memory Module. The main difference is that DIMM has pins and chips on both sides of the RAM sticking out, giving it twice the capacity of a normal stick of RAM. Modern RAM also belongs to a group called SDRAM, which stands for Synchronous Dynamic RAM. Originally, DRAM had its own clock speed that was independent from the computer's processor. So what that basically means is that, so a clock speed is a set interval of time that would run instructions. So this dynamic RAM would have its own clock speed, which means that it would run at a different speed than the computer's processor. And synchronous dynamic RAM means that it synchronizes with the computer's processor to have the exact same clock speed. Now, DRAM wasn't ideal for the evolution of modern systems, so SDRAM came out, allowing RAM to be synchronous with the CPU's clock speed. So when you go to the store and purchase a new desktop, you're almost certainly going to have DDR3, DIMM, SDRAM. But what about a laptop? Laptops use something called SODIMM, which simply stands for small outline. And there are many other types of RAM to talk about, such as ECC, parity, buffered. Those are a little bit more advanced concepts, but I'm gonna go into those in a future video. And this is a little bit more directed towards a casual, more broad audience. So RAM is easily upgradable for a reason. As technology progresses, you need more and more RAM. So let's just think about Windows XP, all the way back then. Actually, even better, let's go all the way back to Windows 95. Windows 95, you only needed 4 megabytes of RAM. Now Windows 10, the minimum is 2 gigabytes for the 64-bit version. So 4 megabytes of RAM for Windows 95, and you know, to put that into perspective, you could load the entire operating system and be able to use all of the software you needed pretty much with 4 megabytes of RAM, and now you need 2 gigabytes of RAM just to run the operating system and get by. So with that being said, it progresses so quickly that if you weren't able to upgrade your RAM, personal computers wouldn't be that viable because you'd constantly have to buy a new computer. And so it's like if you want to, say you have a home computer and you want to suddenly start doing video editing, your processor's okay, but you only have 4 gigabytes of RAM. You can just go to the store and buy 16 gigabytes of RAM and install it, and that's a lot cheaper than buying a whole new computer. For a user who only plans to use their computer for checking email and browsing the web, you can probably get by on 4 gigabytes of RAM for Windows 10. Now, the minimum is 2 gigabytes, sure, but you need to have more than that to use Google Chrome and to run multiple apps at once. You can get by on 2 gigabytes of RAM, but I promise you, you're gonna punch your keyboard. If you're gonna be doing Microsoft Office stuff, you're gonna want 4 to 8 gigabytes. I would recommend the 8. Especially if you're going to continue doing this and it's for your career, or you're doing taxes or something. You're not going to want to get frustrated at your computer, I promise. So my personal recommendation is that if you're just going to be using your computer for basic use, I would recommend 8 gigabytes of RAM. If you're going to be gaming, I would actually recommend 16 gigabytes of RAM. You can get by on less than that. You can get by on 8, but I would recommend 16 gigabytes because games are starting to require more and more RAM nowadays. If you're video editing, I would say a minimum of 16 gigabytes of RAM. I use Adobe After Effects, and I was using 8 gigabytes of RAM for a while, and it just was not viable. I had to get 16 gigabytes, and even that, I still run into issues. So I would say between 16 and 32 gigabytes of RAM for a video editor. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the inner workings of a computer, purchasing RAM can be pretty intimidating. So Crucial has put together a pretty nice RAM purchasing guide on their website. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. In fact, I would highly recommend using these guides. Even if you are somewhat familiar with building your own PC, I would still recommend using these guides because it just makes sure you're buying the right parts, because you may think you're buying the right part and then you end up getting it, it doesn't work, so you have to send it back. It's just a waste of time. So these podcasts, it's pretty much just going to be me talking about some concept for about 5 to 10 minutes. And right now I'm just going over the basics of hardware. So the next couple podcasts are going to be about what is the CPU, what is the BIOS. I'm going to go over the booting process. I'm going to go over the CompTIA exams. I'm going to go over basic concepts, but I'm also twice a month going to be uploading more formal videos that are going to be much more visually interactive. So please subscribe if you have any interest in technology, because I'm planning on going into pretty great depth on many topics. So I really appreciate you guys. I'm going to link to the blog post that accompanies this in the description. You guys have a great day.